Hi, Hunter. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. And boy, that was a mouthful.
Well, before we jump in, is there anything that you would like to share about yourself, your career journey, this topic? Yeah, just to check in before we jump in.
I'd love to share more. So, right off the bat, I want to say, hi, I'm Yolanda, and I have a compulsion. That is, I have a compulsion to nurture, advocate, and empower myself, not only myself and others, particularly those who are disenfranchised and marginalized. I am the daughter of Josie and Joe Butler, sharecroppers from rural Minnesota, from rural Mississippi. Sorry, I lived in Minnesota. I am one of six siblings. I am the third of six. I am wife to one, mother to four, and BB, that means grandmother, to two beautiful granddaughters. I have a passion for this work because I have been on the forefront of technology for the better part of 25 years. And I have probably seen a lot and done most. And I was in this space when there weren't very many people that looked like me. And quite frankly, there are still not very many people who look like me. Although I have many colleagues and family members and friends who are absolutely credentialed and qualified. So what I'm here to do ultimately is to shed light on the truth. To quote the esteemed Ida B. Wells, the way to right wrongs is to turn the light on the truth. And I'm here to turn the light on the truth regarding implicit bias in the workplace, the fact that it exists, the fact that it is pervasive, and the fact that we can do something about it, and we can do something about it right now.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. I love hearing the context of where we come from. It sounds like you have a beautiful, loving family. I also come from a big family too. I'm the youngest of four, so I'm the wee one in the family. Not so much anymore now that there's grandkids, though. Now they're the wee ones,
right?
In my mind, I'm still the wee one, but not so much. So let's first off, let's call things as they are, right, and help set the stage. So what does implicit bias mean, and how does that show up? How does implicit bias show up in hiring?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll take a little step back for a second. About 25 years ago, a social psychologist by the name of Anthony Greenwald of the University of Washington, he developed a test that exposed some uncomfortable aspects of the human mind. And that was people have deep-seated biases of which they're completely unaware. In the colloquial language, we call this unconscious bias, but in scientific language, it is also called implicit bias. These hidden attitudes often influence the way we act towards one another, and often with unintended discriminatory consequences. Now, when we talk about how pervasive implicit bias is, well, Greenwald and his colleagues discovered a particular implicit bias, one of many, but around race. And this particular bias showed up in about 70 to 75% of all the Americans who attempted this test. That is alarming to me. And I don't think the data show any significant variation 25 years later. So it showed up more strongly in white Americans and Asian Americans than in mixed race or African Americans. Now, African Americans, you'd think, might show just the reversed effect, that it would be easy for them to put African American together with a pleasant connotation and white Americans together with unpleasant connotations. But no, these tests demonstrated that African Americans even show, on average, neither direction of bias on the task. So when we say implicit bias, what we mean to say are visceral, emotional reactions to a word, a symbol, or picture that demonstrate how intrinsically our attitudes, beliefs, and worldview impact our day-to-day life.
Thank you for setting that stage for us. And I hadn't heard those exact numbers before, and that is, I have to say, it's alarming and unsurprising to me to hear that data, unfortunately. So you started to talk about how pervasive implicit bias is, and that can show up in interviews. But can you talk about, before we jump in how to avoid it, can you talk about maybe some examples of how it does show up, that maybe people, like you also said, it can also be called unconscious bias.
Yes.
So how does that just pop up for people that are going through resumes or having a talk with someone, and they're completely unawares of the biases that are running in the background for them and informing their decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's play a word association game. I have two granddaughters, and it sounds like you may also have grandchildren. So I love playing games. This will be very straightforward and very simple. What I'm going to ask you and the audience who's listening to do is, I'll say the name of a flower, an insect, or an animal, and I'd just like you to say pleasant or unpleasant as a verbal, audible response. Ready?
You want me to jump in too?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Here we go.
Here we go. Let's do it.
All right. Bumblebee,
Pleasant.
snake,
Pleasant.
rat,
Unpleasant.
ladybug,
Pleasant.
rose,
Pleasant.
butterfly,
Pleasant.
wasp,
Unpleasant.
dandelion.
Pleasant.
Thank you so much for bearing with me through that. I know it was kind of impromptu and off the cuff, but it's a lot of fun. And that's the whole point of the test. Now, I am no social scientist, but I think like one. And the idea is to get you to be able to sense either intrinsically or consciously what your association with these words may mean. Now, I have another one. It's really quick. What I'll do is I'll name some common names in our culture. This time, don't give a verbal response. Just note and observe your reactions internally. Ready? Del Bigtree, Helen Sanchez, Monique Jones, Brian Schultz, Linda Wong, Mohammed Akbar. Just take a moment and reflect on your reactions. And I invite you to consider what else is attached to the reactions that is below the threshold of your conscious awareness around the names of the flowers, insects, and animals, as well as the common names in our American culture. How might these attitudes, perceptions, and judgments impact your hiring decisions and conduct in the workplace? Now, I know you asked me to give some examples, and I will go through the 5, but I really wanted to do this live exercise so that we can get a sense of how implicit bias works, and also ways that we can be more aware when we do have implicit bias that arises. Now, you don't have to take my word for this, or even Anthony Greenwald or his colleagues. I invite you at some point, perhaps today, perhaps later in the week, sometime this year, to simply go to implicit.harvard.edu and take this test for yourself.
Thank you so much for that. It was fascinating to jump in and to also just notice, like, when we were starting with the animals, it's a little more neutral. It's a little safer space. There isn't any fear of offending anyone. And also I could feel my, like, oh, I've changed my mind about some of these animals. You know, like when I said snake, probably a lot of people say unpleasant, but I've actually grown to really enjoy snakes. Yet it's like association around wasps, I don't know that that's ever going to change, but there might be room for it.
Sure, and thank you for that feedback and for being so open and honest about your reactions. When I have to admit, I was surprised when you said pleasant with snake, because again, like you said, most people associate snakes with very unpleasant connotations, thoughts, or emotions. Now, imagine for a second, you are a hiring manager and you'd like to interview a wasp, a dandelion, and a snake. It sounds like three people meet in a bar, right? So going into that hiring interview and the whole process, you're going to bring along all of what it means for you when you hear snake, wasp, or dandelion. And that is what we're trying to unpack today, trying to demonstrate that there is a visceral, real impact to our preconceived notions, thoughts, ideologies, in hiring practices that does not go out the window when we enter the corporate workspace. In fact, I would say perhaps it's even more pervasive because it's a contained environment and people tend to, depending on the situation, tend to perhaps feel more emboldened or more empowered to bring forth their true behaviors, thoughts, proclivities, whatever they may be.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, please.
Now, I'd like to talk specifically about the 5 main implicit biases that social scientists have determined affect hiring decisions. And then I'd also, of course, like to round that out with some ways that we can overcome these biases even this very moment. So the first is affinity bias. Now, this bias is an unconscious tendency to get along with people you like, right? The people that perhaps have a shared background or common interest. For example, candidates who attended the same college or who grew up in the same town. Another example could be getting along with interview candidates that remind us of ourselves or someone we really know and like. Now, you might think that this is a positive impact or effect, but not necessarily so. Affinity bias can cloud judgment around hiring decisions so that you're really kind of cherry picking people that you like and who look like you and think like you and eat the same things you eat and drive the same car you drive. That really does no service, not only to our teams, but really to our society. Now, the second is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency of people to favor information that conforms or strengthens their pre-existing beliefs or notions. Existing beliefs about a certain group of people being more competent than another, for example, is a really classic case of a strong confirmation bias. The halo effect. The halo effect means one outstanding accomplishment on a resume or exposed during the interview process can create an overall impression of success that to the interviewer could perhaps obscure less successful behavioral examples in one or more competencies. The reverse can also happen as well. So for example, interviewers may spot a candidate's weakness in one competency during the interview and then allow that to obscure important strengths that really could demonstrate the ability to be successful in the role. How about compelling communicator? We've all seen that or heard that or written that on our own resumes. Compelling communicator is one competency that's prone to the halo effect. In fact, interviewers often mistake skills in speaking for effectiveness in other areas. On the other hand, an interviewer might form a negative overall opinion about a candidate who has strengths in other job-related areas, but whose oral communication skills may be mediocre. An example of this is when an English is a second language for the job candidate. Another pervasive bias is groupthink. Now, groupthink is really pervasive in corporate environments. I've seen it for decades. And it hasn't gone away. And I think this is probably one of the most challenging aspects to overcome. But groupthink in the hiring process translates into overlooking qualified candidates to hire when the leader or the most outspoken person in the group has chosen the best candidate. So it erases the opinions of all the other individuals in the hiring group to conform to the hiring preference of one person. And then there's perception bias. Perception bias is the tendency to form stereotypes and assumptions about a certain group that makes it impossible to make an objective judgment about members of these groups. For example, a candidate from a highly respected organization, we call this name dropping, say Harvard or Deloitte or one of the big 5 law firms, something to that effect. That candidate can be perceived to be the top candidate, regardless of their skills, experience, effectiveness, or past performance. There is one honorable mention I'd like to call out, and it is around, in the age of information, artificial intelligence or algorithm bias. Now, who creates the algorithms for artificial intelligence databases? Well, humans do. So the historical databases used to develop these algorithms to make hiring decisions, they're biased too. So they incorporate the biases of past decision makers or past historic performance. Case in point, in 2014, Amazon rolled out artificial intelligence to assist in its hiring processes. They were all gung-ho. It was the holy grail. It was going to be the lifesaver of every talent associate or a talent acquisition HR you could imagine. So what they did is they rolled this out live in production. And then they uncovered some disturbing performance from the AI. That is, the AI tended to pick genders that were historically associated in tech. And that was primarily men. And so in 2015, they scrapped the whole project. And there are many other examples that I can demonstrate, but we have a lot to learn, even with artificial intelligence around implicit bias.
Yeah, there's so much in there. There's so many different forms of bias that I think it's inspiring to hear that we can name it and that we can see it, but without someone helping us, how do folks become aware? Do we need more training? Do we need more individual research? How can teams, hiring teams specifically, be aware of these different types of biases and then control their own during implicit biases during these hiring processes? Because clearly, when the example with the AI, excuse me, it was baked in unintentionally, but it was baked in because it was pulling from bias algorithm or bias data.
Absolutely. Excellent question. Thank you so much for asking that. And you are right, it was baked in. It is not only baked into human intelligence, but it is inherently baked into artificial intelligence. And from the research that I've seen recently, there really isn't a silver lining yet or a bright light at the end of the tunnel around AI until we are able, social scientists or computer scientists are able to overcome building in inherent bias. But I have 6 ways that I'd like to share with you and our audience for how we can avoid bias during the interview process. The first is to develop a job success profile. Now, this is something that will require effort on the part of the hiring manager, and if there is a team, effort on the part of the team. A lot of times, the behavior around interviews is that the hiring manager is extremely busy, has a million things to do. They're trying to squeeze interviews in, trying to get the best candidates. They typically only spend about 30 minutes on a resume. That really is a disservice not only to the candidate who's taken the time and care and attention to present themselves for a role, but it also is a disservice to the company the organization and the team. So know what it will take to be successful in the role. Identify the best attributes of your current high-performing team members and make that your job success profile. Now, the next thing you'll want to do after that is to develop an interview guide with planned questions for each competency or success attribute. You'll also then want to develop a scoring rubric for an objective, quantitative methodology as you are tallying up the scores for all possible candidates. Building rapport with your candidate cannot be underscored enough. Rapport with the candidate helps to create a human connection. It's more than a name and words on a piece of paper. This is a person that has taken the time and attention to meet with you, to discuss a role that they could potentially be a good fit for. And it's essential for hiring managers to see them as a person and to see them, more importantly, in the way they want to be seen and not clouded by our unconscious or implicit bias. Now, using team-based hiring has become more common in the workplace. I've used it myself, and it is quite effective. Having at least 2 or 3 interviewers conducting a one-on-one interview before a hiring decision is made is really critical because it gives a sense of another person's perspective on the candidate and their fitness for the role. Conduct a data integration meeting with the interview team after all interviews are conducted. This structured process also provides a framework that will encourage interviewers to challenge one another during the session. And then you want to make sure that you rate the candidates objectively based on your interview guide that you've already developed. And then finally, determine the top candidates based on the candidates' ratings and not on subjective feelings. But when hiring decisions are made based on predetermined, objective criteria that are rigorously applied, they are much less likely to produce disparities.
That's so important to know and to hear that it's really getting down to that valuable data that you're talking about. So important. And so this might be a obvious question, but I think it's important to highlight what are the benefits of reducing implicit bias in the hiring decisions?
Thank you for that question. So right off the bat, as you said, better hiring decisions, period. Better hiring decisions, less turnover for the company, increased diversity for better high-performing teams, fostering an accepting, inclusive, and affirming company culture, and then increasing leadership strengths with a stronger growth culture and a sustained profitable growth. Increasing the reputation of the company as a great place to work. Look, people of color, African Americans, Indigenous people, we want companies to demonstrate commitment to diversity and inclusion and not just have it as a flavor of the day or the month or the year as window dressing. This has to happen not only through leadership, but also through the recruitment policies, the hiring practices, retention and promotion practices, and especially power sharing and corporate culture activities. All of these are important and all of these are essential to overcome the implicit bias that we see and will continue to see in the workplace if important steps aren't taken, and foremost, if the light of truth is not shined on these behaviors and conduct.
Thank you for that, Yolanda. So you have such a well of experience. You obviously are very committed and passionate about this topic. I also feel this overwhelming sense of compassion you have and empathy to want to help people learn about this. Are there things that you would recommend for folks that want to take stock and take some inventory on maybe their own implicit biases. You know, you started us off with an exercise there, and you directed us towards that website where we can take the quiz. Are there other tools, resources, other suggestions that you can offer up to myself and other listeners here?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, Hunter. So I would say training is paramount to overcoming implicit bias. And again, it's such a strongly held belief system. A lot of people, again, are not aware that they even have it. And some people wouldn't readily admit that they have implicit bias. We all do. Every one of us does. It's important to take training, especially for hiring managers. Hiring managers are the gatekeepers in corporate. They are the ones that open and close the door on hiring candidates. And until hiring managers are trained in how to properly interview candidates objectively, rigorously, fairly, will continue to realize these situations where implicit bias is inherent and pervasive in the workplace.
Mhm. You know, we had a few questions come in the chat, and some people are very excited about your role in cybersecurity as well, and how that career journey for you. Is there any advice you would give to folks that are looking to maybe get into in that sort of field, and also perhaps you know, any advice you might give your past self when you were on your career journey? Some things you would have loved to hear.
Gosh, those are two amazing questions, and thank you so much for the accolades for the role. Cybersecurity is a rigorous discipline, and that falls under the envelope of technology or information technology. So it is very specialized training. If a person is interested in obtaining a cybersecurity role, what they would want to start up with, if they're entry level, are the foundational underpinnings of computer science or tech, and then moving into that more specialized training and focus. I would tell my younger self to not back down and to remember the gentleman, well-intended, in Minnetonka, Minnesota, probably one of the least diverse places outside maybe the Arctic or Antarctica on the planet. When I walked in the room, highly trained, highly skilled, highly credentialed, as a new candidate, a new consultant in the organization, he sat me down and he wanted to show me how to right button mouse click to copy and paste. So I would tell my younger self to tell him to read your resume.
Oh, thank you for that. Thank you for that. Yeah, reach for the resume. Hello. Go with the facts, go with the data, go with the person that is sitting in front of you that is fully qualified. Yeah, I'm sorry that was an experience that was unpleasant for you, but I am grateful to hear. Thank you for sharing that, that you can see that as a point that was, you know, they taught you something when they didn't mean to teach you what they taught you, you know, and that you were able to take an uncomfortable situation and use it actually as a way to empower yourself. So thank you for shedding that light on that truth. Thank you.
Thank you, Hunter. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. And Yolanda, if people want to keep the conversation going with you, how can they reach out?
Yes, they can reach me at yolanda.butler@3ds.com.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you, Yolanda, for making the time today. It was such a pleasure, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You as well. Take good care.